After his promotion at the office, my husband arrogantly shouted insults at me. "I'm sick of wasting money on your useless living expenses," he snapped. Then he demanded that we separate our bank accounts. "Starting tomorrow, we split finances. My money is mine. Take care of yourself." With a smile, I agreed. But the next day, after he came home from work and stepped into the house, my husband screamed hysterically because... Before the story begins, please write in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so the Midnight Stories channel can continue to grow and bring you even more compelling stories. The old sedan's engine rattled before finally dying in the yard of a modest but cozy rental house. Andrew stepped out of the car looking very different from usual. His stride was lighter, his chest puffed out, his chin lifted high. In his hand was a brand new leather briefcase he had bought earlier that day with his credit card, a gift to himself. He had just received the official letter he had dreamed of for the past 3 years. The position of branch manager was finally his. Thoughts of a higher salary, a company car allowance, and the respect of his subordinates danced in his head from the moment he left the executive office. He felt as though the world now lay beneath his feet. Andrew believed all of this success came purely from his own hard work, intelligence, and sweat. He forgot to look around, or rather, he chose not to see the role others had played in his life. He opened the front door roughly, unlike his usual habit of greeting gently. He tossed his new briefcase onto the living room sofa and loosened the tie that felt suffocating around his neck. The scent of simple home-cooked food drifted from the kitchen, vegetable soup and fried fish. It used to be his favorite meal back when they were still struggling in the early years of marriage. But today, the smell made Andrew wrinkle his nose in disgust. He felt such food was no longer suitable for someone of his new status. Sarah, his wife, appeared from the kitchen wearing a neatly arranged shawl and simple house clothes. Her face looked tired, yet it still radiated calm warmth. She greeted him with a sincere smile, ready to listen to his day as always. That smile faded instantly when she met Andrew's cold stare. Sarah placed the glass of iced tea on the table and reached for his hand, a routine she had never missed. But Andrew pulled his hand away sharply as if her touch were filthy. Sarah froze, her hand suspended in midair. She searched his eyes for the warmth that used to live there, but found only unfamiliar arrogance. Andrew looked her up and down with contempt. To him now, Sarah was nothing more than a housewife who earned nothing, wasted his money, and contributed nothing to his career success. He forgot that Sarah was the one who ironed his shirts perfectly every night, prepared his lunches so he wouldn't waste money outside, and carefully managed their tight finances so they could survive until the end of each month. Andrew raised his voice, loud and harsh. He poured out his resentment, mocking the food she cooked and calling it cheap, backward food, unworthy of a company executive like him. He complained about the house being dirty, even though Sarah mopped the floors twice a day. Every word cut into Sarah's heart like a blade, yet she remained silent. Andrew grew more empowered by her silence. He believed he was right and that Sarah had no defense because she truly was a burden. The peak of his cruelty came when he brought up money. He pulled bills from his wallet and threw the electricity and water statements into Sarah's face. The paper scattered across the floor. "I'm sick of this," he shouted. "I work myself to death just to support your useless life." He called her a parasite, someone who only took and never gave. He counted every dollar he had ever spent on groceries as if it were an unforgivable debt. Breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger, he delivered the sentence that would change their marriage forever. From that moment, he wanted to separate their finances completely. He didn't want Sarah controlling his money anymore. His salary, now much larger, was for his new lifestyle, not household expenses he deemed wasteful. Then he said the words that shattered everything. "I'm sick of wasting money on you." Silence fell. Only the ticking wall clock echoed through the room, as if it were counting down the collapse of Andrew's ego. Slowly, Sarah lowered her head and picked up the iced tea she had prepared earlier. She took a small sip, calming the storm inside. When she lifted her face again, there were no tears, no pleading, no hysteria. Instead, her lips curved to a smile. It was sweet, yet unsettling. Her eyes, once gentle, were now calm and deep, like a dark lake hiding unknown depths. In a steady, controlled voice, Sarah agreed. If that was what Andrew wanted, she would comply. They would separate their accounts and assets starting immediately. She promised she would never touch Andrew's money again. She even confirmed once more, making sure Andrew truly wanted a total financial separation. Feeling victorious, Andrew nodded with a smug grin. He imagined a free life filled with money and luxury, unburdened by his wife. Without another word, he walked into the bedroom, leaving Sarah standing alone in the living room. That night, Andrew slept soundly, dreaming of new cars and admiration. He didn't know that Sarah was awake. She sat at the dining room table, opening a small black notebook. She made a quiet but firm phone call, instructing someone to send a moving truck early the next morning, right after Andrew left for work. She also called a man named Daniel, asking him to prepare important documents. Sarah looked around the house she had lovingly cared for over 5 years. Her gaze was empty now. Her love had been betrayed by arrogance. She closed the notebook. Tomorrow, Andrew would learn the true meaning of ownership. Sarah smiled again. This time, the smile meant the real game had just begun. The morning sun slipped through the curtains, waking Andrew from his pleasant dreams. He stretched lazily, expecting the smell of hot coffee waiting for him as usual. But the house was silent. No clinking cutlery, no breakfast aroma, no gentle voice calling his name. Annoyed, Andrew assumed Sarah was sulking over last night's argument. Let her be, he thought. He had money now. He could buy an expensive breakfast on his way to office. He dressed quickly, sprayed on his new luxury cologne, and walked through the living room. Sarah was sitting calmly on the porch, reading a magazine. No breakfast on the table. Andrew ignored her, walking past with arrogance, slamming the car door before speeding off towards the office. Sarah glanced briefly at the departing car, then returned to her magazine. Moments later, a large yellow truck stopped in front of the house. Several uniformed men stepped out and began working according to Sarah's instructions. At the office, Andrew felt like a king. He showed off his new business card and began flirting with Vivian, the stylish new secretary. He took her to an upscale restaurant, spending on lunch what Sarah used for an entire week. Vivian showered him with praise, inflating his ego even more. Andrew felt this was the life he deserved. He forgot that his credit card bills would arrive next month. He forgot that his new salary hadn't even been paid yet. He relied only on his shrinking savings. That afternoon, Andrew returned home cheerfully, imagining himself relaxing on the sofa while watching a football match on his 60-inch flat-screen TV. He even planned to flaunt his expensive lunch receipt in front of Sarah, just to provoke her, to prove that he could enjoy fine dining perfectly well without her. His car turned into the driveway. The house looked dark. The porch light wasn't on, even though dusk had already settled in. Andrew muttered under his breath, blaming Sarah for being lazy and careless enough to forget turning on the lights. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door while fishing the keys out of his pocket. The moment the door opened, Andrew felt something was wrong. The sound of his footsteps echoed, bouncing off walls that felt unnaturally bare. He reached for the light switch and flipped it. The fluorescent lights flooded the room. That was when Andrew screamed. His eyes widened in horror, as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. The briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. The sight before him made no sense. The living room was empty. Completely empty. The imported leather sofa, the elegant glass table, the thick fur rug, the display cabinet filled with crystal ornaments, the paintings on the walls, even the luxurious curtains were gone. Nothing remained except the thin layer of dust on the floor, marking where those items once stood. Andrew ran frantically into the family room. Empty. The large TV he was so proud of, the home theater system, the solid wood dining table, the double-door refrigerator, the water dispenser, the microwave. All gone. The kitchen was spotless, too spotless. No stove, no plates, not even a spoon. Andrew felt like he was losing his mind. He dashed into the master bedroom. The king-size bed was gone. The massive wardrobe that once held his clothes had vanished as well. In the center of the room lay only a thin, worn-out foam mattress, the same one he used back when he was still a college student, lying directly on the cold, tiled floor. A messy pile of his work clothes sat on top of it. Andrew shouted Sarah's name, his voice filled with panic and rage. He thought the house had been completely robbed. He rushed outside and found Sarah sitting calmly on a cheap plastic chair on the porch, the only chair left. She was sipping warm tea from a plastic cup. Her face was serene, a stark contrast to Andrew's pale, sweat-soaked expression. Andrew exploded, demanding to know where all their belongings had gone. He accused Sarah of negligence, of letting thieves empty the house while he was at work. He hurled insults at her, calling her a foolish wife, incapable of protecting their property. Sarah slowly placed the plastic cup down. She stood up and looked Andrew straight in the eyes. In a casual yet piercing tone, Sarah explained everything. She reminded him of their agreement the night before. Andrew had demanded a separation of assets. He said his money was his and Sarah was to take care of herself. Sarah calmly explained that every piece of furniture that was gone, the sofa, the television, the refrigerator, even the bed, had been purchased using her personal savings and money she had inherited from her late father. She had all the receipts, all under her own name. Since Andrew wanted a clear separation, she simply took everything that belonged to her. Andrew stood frozen, his mouth hanging open. He tried to recall the past, and his heart sank as realization struck. His salary had only ever been enough to cover car installments and his lifestyle. It was Sarah who had quietly furnished the house, buying things little by little so their home could feel comfortable. Sarah pointed toward the thin foam mattress inside the bedroom. She said that mattress was the only item bought with Andrew's money 5 years ago. That meant it was the only asset Andrew owned in that house. She also informed him that she had already rented an apartment for herself and all her belongings had been moved there. Sarah picked up her handbag and walked toward the gate where a rideshare taxi was waiting. Before getting in, she turned back and looked at Andrew, who still stood motionless on the porch of the dark, empty house. She wished him good night and told him to enjoy sleeping on the only asset he owned. Andrew couldn't move. He could only watch his wife's back disappear into the night. That evening, in the large yet hollow house that echoed with emptiness, Andrew knelt on the thin foam mattress. He was hungry, but there was no stove to cook with and no cash in his wallet. He had spent it all treating Vivian earlier that day. In the painful silence, for the first time, Andrew's arrogance began to crack. replaced by a suffocating loneliness. The next morning, Andrew woke up with a sharp pain stabbing his back. The thin foam mattress from his college days had long lost its support, leaving his body aching after a night on cold tiles. He blinked, hoping the empty room was just a nightmare. Reality hit him hard. The bare ceiling without a chandelier, the plain walls without paintings, and the absence of a wardrobe confirmed it all. Sarah was really gone, and she had taken everything. Ignoring the hunger gnawing at his stomach, Andrew staggered toward the bathroom, intending to clean himself before work. He turned on the faucet. Nothing. Just a faint hiss of air before it went silent. Frowning, he tried another tap. Same result. Annoyed, he flipped the bathroom light switch. No light. Panic crept in. He ran to the main switch in the living room and tried turning on the lights. Nothing. The ceiling fan didn't move either. The electricity was completely cut off. Feeling hot and increasingly anxious, Andrew grabbed his phone with trembling hands and called the utility company. He shouted at the operator, demanding an explanation for the sudden power outage, declaring himself a busy corporate executive with no time for such nonsense. The calm response on the other end left him speechless. The operator explained that the electricity had been disconnected due to unpaid bills for 3 consecutive months. Andrew's eyes widened. He had always assumed the household money he gave Sarah covered everything. In truth, it hadn't. Sarah had been quietly paying the shortfall for electricity and water using her own money, never once complaining. Andrew hung up weakly and called the water company. Same answer. To restore services that day, he would need to pay all outstanding balances, penalties, and reconnection fees. The amount was significant. He checked his mobile banking app. The remaining balance made his throat tighten. His savings had been drained by the expensive leather briefcase and the luxury lunch he treated Vivian to. With shaking hands, Andrew transferred the rest of his savings to settle the bills. He had no choice. He needed water to bathe and electricity to iron his clothes. He couldn't show up at the office dirty and disheveled. Just as he finished paying, loud knocking echoed from the front door. Andrew opened it to find a stocky middle-aged man with a sour expression. It was Mr. Collins, the landlord of the rental house. Andrew forced a stiff smile, greeting him politely. Mr. Collins didn't smile back. He immediately demanded the annual rent, which was due that very day. Confused, Andrew mentioned the amount he usually gave Sarah for rent. Mr. Collins scoffed and pulled out a worn notebook. The real rent for the upscale neighborhood was double that amount. For 5 years, Andrew had only been paying half. Sarah had secretly covered the rest. She had always told Andrew she was good at negotiating prices. In reality, she had been subsidizing their lifestyle so he could live comfortably without feeling burdened. Mr. Collins issued an ultimatum: pay today or move out immediately. There were other tenants waiting. Andrew's world collapsed. His account was empty. With no other option and too much pride to be evicted like a vagrant, Andrew called a coworker and borrowed money, lying about having left his wallet at home. After paying the rent, Andrew collapsed on the empty living room floor. There was no wall clock, but he knew he was already late for work. His stomach growled loudly. He went into the kitchen, hoping to find something to eat. Nothing. No rice, no instant noodles, not even salt. Sarah had taken everything. Andrew finally went to work on an empty stomach, relying on newly restored tap water to suppress his hunger. Inside the car, he slammed the steering wheel in frustration. For the first time, he realized that the useless life he accused Sarah of living had actually been fully supported by her. Andrew stepped into the office lobby, gathering the last scraps of confidence he could muster. He forced a stiff smile at the receptionist. His suit was slightly wrinkled at the back, ironed hastily on the floor that morning. But he believed no one would notice. After all, in this office, he was the new manager, the rising star.
Andrew tried to push away the image of the empty house and the suffocating bills. He was determined to prove that he was fine, even better off without Sarah. He wanted to show the world that he was an independent, successful man. When lunchtime arrived, Andrew noticed Vivian tidying up her desk. Today, Vivian looked stunning in her fashionable office outfit, a sharp contrast to Sarah's modest and understated appearance. Andrew approached her desk, putting on the most charming smile he could muster. In a deliberately smooth voice, he invited Vivian to lunch at a fine dining restaurant not far from the office. That restaurant used to be a special place for Andrew and Sarah, where they celebrated milestones together. Andrew chose it deliberately. He wanted to show off and, more importantly, convince himself that he could still afford luxury. Vivian, who adored a high-end lifestyle, accepted enthusiastically. Her eyes sparkled as if she were staring at a walking gold mine. They arrived at the restaurant and were warmly welcomed by the staff. The waiter greeted Andrew by name with great respect. He was a regular there. Andrew felt a surge of pride and glanced at Vivian, who looked impressed by the VIP treatment. They were seated by the window with a beautiful city view. Vivian confidently ordered the most expensive items on the menu: premium imported steak, seafood appetizers, and a tropical fruit drink that cost the equivalent of Andrew's 3 days of meals at a cheap diner. Andrew simply smiled and nodded. Though anxiety crept into his mind, he reminded himself that his credit card limit should still be enough. Throughout lunch, Andrew boasted about major projects he would soon handle and his plans for an overseas vacation at the end of the year. Vivian listened with admiration, occasionally praising his intelligence and success. Her compliments were like cool water on the wounded ego Andrew desperately tried to protect. For a moment, Andrew forgot that at home he no longer had a proper bed and that he was already in debt to a coworker. In that moment, he felt like the king of the world. The food tasted exquisite, and Vivian's laughter sounded like music to his ears. Then came the most nerve-wracking moment: the bill. A waiter arrived carrying a closed check folder. Andrew peeked inside. The number was staggering, but he kept his face calm. With a practiced, elegant motion, he pulled out his platinum credit card and placed it on the tray. The waiter bowed politely and walked away. Andrew resumed chatting with Vivian, casually criticizing his wasteful ex-wife, a lie he told to mask his own guilt. Vivian responded with feigned sympathy, saying Andrew deserved a woman who truly understood his lifestyle. 5 minutes passed. The waiter returned, looking slightly uncomfortable. He whispered that the card had been declined. Andrew froze, but forced a chuckle. He told Vivian it must be a system error. He handed over his second credit card, the backup one he rarely used. The waiter left again. Andrew began to sweat. His legs fidgeted under the table. Vivian's gaze shifted, curiosity creeping in as her smile slowly faded. Soon, the waiter returned, this time accompanied by the restaurant manager. The manager, who also knew Andrew, spoke politely but loud enough for Vivian to hear. Both cards had been rejected. Andrew felt panic and anger surge through him. He was about to blame the restaurant system when the manager calmly interrupted. He explained that Andrew's cards were supplementary cards linked to the primary account under Mrs. Sarah's name. That very morning, the bank had confirmed that the primary card holder, Sarah, had blocked all supplementary cards and canceled the automatic payment arrangements for the restaurant. Andrew's face flushed crimson. It felt like being publicly slapped. His blood rushed with humiliation. He turned to Vivian, hoping for support, but her expression had completely changed. The admiration was gone, replaced with disdain and cold judgment. Vivian scoffed, realizing the man in front of him had no real financial power. Without a word, she pulled out cash to pay for her own meal, stood up, and curtly said she had to return to the office for an urgent matter. She left without looking back. Andrew was left alone at the table, a silent spectacle for the staff and nearby diners. He didn't have enough cash to cover the remaining bill. With his dignity shattered, he was forced to leave his expensive watch, the last luxury item he owned, as collateral at the cashier. He walked out of the restaurant under the scorching midday sun. The heat burned his skin, but his heart felt frozen. Only then did he realize that the luxury he had enjoyed, credit cards, VIP status, all of it, had been provided by Sarah. Without her, he was a man who couldn't even pay for his own lunch. His mask of wealth had cracked, revealing how fragile he really was. The days that followed were filled with suffocating anxiety. The luxurious rental house that once felt warm now resembled a cold, hollow cave. Without furniture, even the smallest sound echoed painfully through the walls. That evening, Andrew ate plain white bread without butter, sitting cross-legged on the hard living room floor. He stared at his silent phone. No messages from Vivian. She had completely disappeared after discovering his cards were declined. Shame and anger churned inside him, yet he continued to deny reality. He convinced himself this was only a temporary setback. Once his first salary as branch manager was paid, he would buy new furniture and prove everyone wrong. The next afternoon, as Andrew returned exhausted, a taxi stopped in front of his gate. He peeked through the window. His heart pounded. An older, heavier woman stepped out carrying 2 large bags and a cardboard box tied with rope. It was his mother, Mrs. Rotmy, who had traveled all the way from her hometown. Andrew slapped his forehead. He had completely forgotten her visit, meant to celebrate his promotion. Sarah would have arranged everything, but Sarah was gone. Panicking, Andrew rushed outside, forcing a smile as he greeted and kissed his mother's hand, trying to appear dutiful. Mrs. Rotmy immediately bombarded him with questions: why no one picked her up at the terminal, why his phone was unreachable, and why the house felt so empty. Andrew lied, claiming he'd been stuck in meetings and his phone battery had died. He paid the taxi fare using the last cash in his wallet and carried her belongings inside. The moment Mrs. Rotmy stepped into the living room, she froze. Her eyes scanned the space in horror. The bare floor, the empty walls, the absence of sofas. Everything was gone. She shouted, accusing him of being robbed. Andrew nervously launched into another lie, claiming they were renovating and switching to a modern minimalist style. He claimed all the old furniture had been sold and new imported pieces were on the way. Skeptical but blindly proud of his son, Mrs. Rotmy tried to believe him. She searched for a place to sit and found none. Grumbling, she sat directly on the floor, complaining about her aching back. Then she asked, "Where is Sarah? Why hasn't she greeted me with drinks and snacks?" Andrew said Sarah had gone to her parents' house for an urgent matter. At the mention of Sarah's name, Mrs. Rotmy's face darkened. She began criticizing her daughter-in-law, accusing her of being disrespectful and irresponsible. Andrew stayed silent, his heart aching. In the empty house, his mother's words felt like cruel irony. Sarah had always prepared the guest room, cooked her favorite meals, and even massaged her feet without being asked. Now there was no cold water, no food, no soft bed. The conflict escalated when Mrs. Rotmy demanded her monthly allowance. She complained loudly that the transfer hadn't arrived and that she needed the money to fix her roof and buy new jewelry for a wedding invitation. Andrew frowned. He was certain he had set up an automatic transfer of $70 each month. He insisted the money had been sent. Instead of calming down, Mrs. Rotmy exploded. She threw her handbag to the floor and screamed that Andrew had become stingy since his promotion.
Mrs. Rotmy snapped back, saying that she usually received $280 every month, not $70. She accused Andrew of cutting his own mother's allowance just to satisfy his wife's lavish lifestyle.
Andrew stared at her in shock. He swore to God that for the past 5 years of his career, he had only ever transferred $70 a month from his salary account. He had never sent $280. Never. Mrs. Rodney refused to back down. She pulled out her savings passbook and shoved it toward him. There, clearly printed, were monthly transfers of $280, each labeled "From my beloved son." Andrew snatched the passbook and examined it carefully. The transfer dates matched his payday exactly, but the amounts were drastically different. His head began to spin. Slowly, the truth unraveled in his mind. All this time, Sarah had been adding $210 every month to Andrew's mother's account without telling him. She had used her own money but sent it in Andrew's name so that he would appear to be a devoted, successful son in his mother's eyes. Sarah had quietly covered Andrew's shortcomings to protect his dignity. Andrew collapsed onto the floor. His legs felt weak, boneless. He finally understood the magnitude of Sarah's sacrifices he had wasted and never acknowledged. She never asked for praise, never once mentioned that most of the money sent to his mother came from her own pocket. Sarah let Andrew receive all the compliments and prayers from his mother, while she herself endured insults and was labeled a useless daughter-in-law. Regret slammed into Andrew's chest with full force. He watched his mother continue to curse Sarah, calling her a wasteful woman who drained Andrew's money and prevented him from sending the full $280. Andrew wanted to scream. He wanted to defend Sarah, to declare that she was the true hero. But his voice died in his throat. His pride was still too strong to admit that he had never been capable of supporting his mother on his own. That night, the rental house became a living hell. Andrew had no money to buy proper food. He was forced to cook instant noodles he bought on credit from a neighbor's small shop. Mrs. Rodney refused to eat them. She felt humiliated. She cried loudly, wailing that her son had become unfilial, feeding her trash despite holding a high-ranking position. Andrew lowered his head, silent, crushed. When bedtime came, another problem arose. There was no guest bed. The thin foam mattress in Andrew's bedroom was far too small and completely inappropriate for his mother to share with an adult son. In the end, Andrew gave in. He handed the thin mattress to his mother and slept on the hard floor himself, using stacked cardboard boxes as a makeshift mat. In the quiet of the night, accompanied by his mother's exhausted snoring, Andrew stared at the dark ceiling. His body ached, his stomach burned with hunger, and his heart was shattered. He heard his mother mumbling in her sleep, bragging to imaginary neighbors back home about Andrew's success, claiming her son could buy anything. For the first time, tears slipped from his eyes. He realized the success he had always boasted about was nothing more than an illusion. Without Sarah's financial management and her silent subsidies, he was merely a mediocre salaried man, one who couldn't even afford a proper bed for his own mother. He had driven away the woman who supported his entire life, and now the foundation of that life was collapsing onto him. The next morning, Andrew went to work in far worse condition than before. His eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, his back felt stiff as a wooden board, and his shirt was wrinkled because he hadn't had time to iron it properly. He left his mother at home with a false promise that he would return with plenty of money and good food that evening. On the way to the office, his thoughts were in chaos. He had to face an important meeting with Mr. Herman, one of the company's biggest clients. The project with Mr. Herman was the key to his branch's annual targets. Andrew tried to gather what little confidence he had left. He told himself he was a great manager. He could handle this. After all, hadn't his projects always succeeded before? Surely his negotiation skills would save him today. When he arrived at the office, the atmosphere felt off. off. Several staff members whispered as they noticed his disheveled appearance. Andrew ignored them and went straight to his office, asking Vivian to prepare the presentation files for Mr. Herman. Vivian entered his office with a cold expression, no flirtatious smile this time. She dropped the stack of documents onto his desk roughly. Andrew tried to be friendly, but she responded curtly and left immediately. Andrew opened the files and began reading. Cold sweat trickled down his temples. Rows of numbers, market analysis charts, and technical terms stared at him unfamiliar. In the past, before every major presentation, Sarah had always helped him study the material at home. She summarized key points, explained risk gaps, and even offered negotiation strategies. Only now did Andrew realize that all this time he had merely been the face in front of the clients. The brain behind every strategy had been his wife. At exactly 10 a.m., Mr. Herman arrived with his team. The middle-aged man carried an air of authority. They sat in the cold conference room as Andrew began presenting the contract renewal proposal. He spoke confidently, using polished words and promises of high returns. But when the Q&A session began, his mask started to crack. Mr. Herman asked specific questions about market fluctuation, risk mitigation, and the impact of new regulations on the supply chain. Andrew froze. He didn't know the answers. He responded with vague, circular statements. Mr. Herman frowned, clearly dissatisfied. Then Mr. Herman asked about the third quarter analysis usually attached to Andrew's proposals, the very analysis that had kept him a loyal client because of its sharp predictions and brilliant solutions. Andrew was confused. He had never consciously prepared such analysis. Then he remembered Sarah often slipped extra pages into his work bag before important meetings, saying, "Just some notes for you to read." Those small notes had been the true key to his success. Without Sarah's input, Andrew's proposal was nothing more than a boring stack of standard paperwork. Stammering, Andrew claimed his team had forgotten to attach the analysis. Mr. Herman stared at him sharply, as if stripping him bare. He closed the proposal folder with a loud snap that made everyone in the room flinch. In a heavy voice, Mr. Herman said he was deeply disappointed. Then he revealed a truth that made Andrew's blood run cold. Mr. Herman said he knew Sarah's father. He knew Sarah's background, top graduate in business management. He admitted that he continued working with Andrew, not because Andrew was exceptional, but because he recognized Sarah's influence in every strategy Andrew presented. Mr. Herman respected Andrew as Sarah's husband, but then he continued. He heard that Andrew had treated Sarah poorly, had even driven her away. Mr. Herman said he was a businessman who valued ethics and trust. If Andrew could betray the person who supported him most at home, how could he be trusted not to betray business partners? Those words struck Andrew straight in the chest. Mr. Herman stood up, straightened his suit, and announced he was canceling all contract renewal plans. He would withdraw his investment and move to a competitor. He left the room without shaking Andrew's hand, followed by his team. Andrew stood frozen before the still-lit projector screen as his staff stared at him with blaming eyes. Before he could process his failure, the intercom buzzed. The CEO's secretary called him to immediately report to Mr. Gunawan, the company's CEO. Andrew walked toward the executive office like a man heading to the gallows. Inside, Mr. Gunawan waited with a face red with rage. Mr. Herman had already called and explained everything. Mr. Gunawan tore into Andrew, calling him incompetent, careless, and responsible for massive financial losses due to the departure of a key client. He threw his monthly performance reports across the room. Then came another painful truth. Andrew's performance charts were average at best and declining in technical aspects. The only reason he had been promoted was due to glowing testimonials from major clients like Mr. Herman. Now it was clear those testimonials weren't because of Andrew, but because of the shadow consultant behind him. Mr. Gunawan issued a final warning. Andrew had 1 month to recover the client or drastically improve his performance. Failure meant termination. Andrew left the CEO's office with trembling knees. The world spun around him. Back at his desk, he stared at the growing pile of work. He tried to focus, but his mind was blank. He didn't know how to build complex strategies without discussing them with Sarah. Desperate, he tried calling her, hoping to beg for help one last time. Her number was inactive. He looked toward Vivian's desk, hoping for some comfort. Instead, he saw her quietly laughing on the phone. When their eyes met, she quickly looked away. Andrew didn't know it, but Vivian was speaking with a competitor, leaking information about Andrew's failure. She was already preparing her own lifeboat, ready to abandon Andrew's sinking ship. That evening, Andrew sat alone in his cubicle as the office lights were turned off one by one. Only then did he fully realize, without Sarah, he was nothing. The career he had built on arrogance was now collapsing onto him, and back home in that empty...
Mrs. Ratme never stopped comparing her current hardship to the comfortable life she once had back in her hometown. She constantly demanded a new mattress, a new television, and proper meals, as if Andrew had a money tree growing in the backyard. Every time Andrew tried to explain that he was struggling financially, his mother would explode in anger, accusing him of hiding money for his new wife or another woman. The truth was far worse. Forget another woman, Andrew could barely afford to feed himself. His first salary as a branch manager had not been paid yet, and the remaining money he borrowed from a coworker was running dangerously low. In that desperation, a cunning idea began to grow in Andrew's mind, an idea nurtured by his mother's bitter whispers. Mrs. Ratme, driven by greed and her simplistic logic, suggested that Andrew file for divorce from Sarah and demand a division of marital assets. According to her, during their 5 years of marriage, everything in the house, including the luxury furniture Sarah had taken with her, was joint property. It did not matter who paid for it. In marriage, everything belonged to both parties. Mrs. Ratme convinced Andrew that he was entitled to half the value of those assets, including Sarah's savings account, which she claimed held a significant amount of money. Blinded by desperation, Andrew latched on to the idea. He saw it as an instant escape from poverty. He imagined paying off his debts, buying new furniture for his mother, and returning to a life of comfort without a second thought. With the last of his remaining money, Andrew hired a cheap lawyer he found through a roadside advertisement to handle the divorce and asset claims. The day of the mediation hearing arrived. Andrew wore his best suit, now noticeably worn and faded from being hand-washed repeatedly. He forced himself to look confident, puffing out his chest as he entered the religious court building. In his mind, he had already crafted a narrative. He was the wronged husband, abandoned by a wife who ran off with everything in the house. He sat in the waiting room with his legs crossed arrogantly, ignoring the sympathetic looks from people around him. Then Sarah arrived. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. Sarah looked radiant, far more so than she was when she was still married to him. She wore elegant yet modest work attire. Her face was calm and glowing. She was not alone. Walking beside her was a tall, composed man with a firm yet polite demeanor. It was Daniel, Sarah's childhood friend, who had become a prominent lawyer in the capital. Seeing Daniel made Andrew's confidence waver, but greed quickly reignited his resolve. Inside the mediation room, the atmosphere was cold and tense. Through his poorly prepared lawyer, Andrew aggressively presented his demands. He demanded a division of marital assets, including the full value of the household furniture Sarah had taken, half of the money in Sarah's bank account, and ownership of the car Andrew used for work. Andrew argued that as the head of the household, he had contributed to the accumulation of those assets.
Even though Sarah technically paid for them, Andrew shamelessly claimed that the luxury rental house they lived in should also be calculated as joint property, insisting that Sarah compensate him for its rental value. Since Sarah had left abruptly, Andrew felt confident the mediator would side with him. Sarah listened without expression. Her hands rested calmly on her lap. Occasionally she glanced at Daniel, who appeared equally composed. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick blue folder. With slow, authoritative movements, he placed it on the table. Daniel spoke in a clear, steady baritone voice, dismantling Andrew's arguments one by one with irrefutable written evidence. As Daniel explained the facts, Andrew's face gradually turned pale. First, regarding the house, Daniel presented the property certificate and lease agreement. The luxury home was not privately owned. It was an asset belonging to Arasanti Group, Sarah's family corporation. For 5 years, Andrew's status had merely been that of a subsidized tenant. Even more shocking, Daniel presented records of unpaid rent. The actual rental price was far higher than what Andrew had been paying. The difference had been covered by Sarah as spousal support. However, since Andrew demanded a professional asset calculation, that subsidy was now legally void. As a result, Andrew owed Sarah's family company hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid rent. Andrew's eyes widened, cold sweat soaked his back. Daniel then moved on to the car. The sedan Andrew proudly drove was not registered under Andrew or Sarah's name. It was a company vehicle belonging to one of Sarah's family subsidiaries, loaned to Andrew under Sarah's recommendation. Daniel presented a formal vehicle retrieval notice. With the divorce in progress, the loan privilege was revoked. Failure to return the car immediately would constitute embezzlement of corporate assets. Lastly, regarding the furniture and savings, Daniel presented legitimate purchase receipts and bank transfer records. All funds used came from Sarah's personal account, originating from inheritance and family dividends, legally classified as premarital assets, not subject to marital division. On the contrary, Daniel revealed household expense records showing that Andrew had never provided adequate financial support during the marriage. Sarah had covered nearly all living expenses. If Andrew insisted on financial calculations, Sarah was prepared to countersue for 5 years of unpaid spousal support. The mediation room fell silent. Andrew felt as if the ground beneath him had collapsed. His attempt to obtain money had backfired into a crushing financial threat he could never repay in his lifetime. His cheap lawyer sat speechless, flipping through papers without knowing what to defend. Andrew looked at Sarah, hoping to find a trace of mercy, but her gaze was empty, as if she were looking at a complete stranger. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice calm yet piercing. She said she was willing to forgive all unpaid rent and spousal support on one condition: Andrew must sign the divorce agreement immediately, relinquish all asset claims, and disappear from her life forever. Andrew trembled violently. His hand, slick with sweat, barely held the pen. He had no choice. Continuing would mean total ruin and possible imprisonment for civil debt. With his dignity shattered to dust, Andrew signed the divorce papers. He left the courthouse with unsteady steps, without a car, without money, without hope. Outside, the sun blazed brightly, but Andrew's world was black. He had to take public transportation home, returning to an empty house to face his mother's inevitable rage over the shattered dream of marital wealth. After the devastating mediation, Andrew's life turned into a living hell. The company car was repossessed by a leasing firm affiliated with Sarah's family, forcing him to commute by ride-hailing services or crowded public transport. Every morning he was crushed between bodies, sweat, and dust, arriving at work looking increasingly worn. At home, Mrs. Ratme grew even more abusive. After learning that Andrew failed to obtain any marital assets and had even lost the car, she verbally attacked him daily, calling him useless and foolish. The mental pressure destroyed Andrew's performance. He became distracted, unfocused, and began making small but fatal mistakes. In the midst of this chaos, Vivian reappeared, not with romantic advances, but with venomous whispers. Vivian knew Andrew's condition and used his desperation for her own sinister agenda. One afternoon, as Andrew stared at overdue credit card bills and endured relentless calls from debt collectors, Vivian entered his office carrying a stack of vendor invoices. She closed the door and sat on the edge of his desk, her gaze suggestive. Vivian said she knew Andrew needed quick cash. She proposed a solution commonly used by former executives. She explained a scheme involving inflated invoices for printing services and office supplies. She claimed to have a contact at the vendor who could create fake receipts. They would split the excess money. Vivian assured him it was safe, routine, and rarely audited. The amount was modest, tens of thousands of dollars, small for the company, but life-changing for Andrew. Andrew hesitated. His conscience screamed that it was corruption, but images of his mother's fury, the relentless debt collector calls, and the growing hunger in his stomach silenced his moral compass.
2 weeks passed in an uneasy calm until one gray morning shattered it all. Andrew had just arrived at the office when he sensed something was wrong. The atmosphere felt heavy, suffocating. The office was unnaturally silent. Employees sat stiffly at their desks, afraid to speak. Vivian was nowhere to be seen. Andrew's heart began to pound. A bad feeling crept over him. Suddenly, the door to Mr. Gunawan's office burst open. The CEO stormed out, his face flushed with rage, followed by several unfamiliar individuals in formal attire, carrying laptops and thick stacks of documents. Mr. Gunawan shouted Andrew's name in a thunderous voice that echoed across the office floor and ordered him to enter the main conference room immediately. Andrew walked forward as if his feet were wrapped in iron shoes. When he entered the conference room, he saw Vivian already seated there, her head bowed low, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed uncontrollably. At the far end of the table sat an external audit team hired directly by headquarters to conduct a sudden financial audit following reports of irregularities. Andrew stared at the lead auditor, who was seated with their back turned on a swivel chair. When the chair slowly rotated, Andrew's world came to a halt. The person sitting there was Sarah. Yes, Sarah, the woman he had divorced, the woman he once dismissed as useless. Sarah now radiated an authority that was terrifying. She wore a sharp black blazer, her shawl neatly arranged, her posture impeccable. Her eyes locked onto Andrew, cold, precise, unwavering. After the divorce, Sarah had returned to the professional world and was immediately recruited by a prestigious audit firm due to her stellar past reputation. Her first client was the very company Andrew worked for. This was no coincidence. This was karma, executed with surgical precision. Sarah did not smile. There was no polite greeting. She was no longer a wife. She was an auditor, here to deliver judgment. She opened the file in front of her and in a calm, analytical voice began presenting her team's findings.
One by one, she revealed concrete evidence of Andrew's embezzlement, from manipulated travel expense claims to the recent procurement markups Andrew had carried out with Vivian. The data was meticulous, complete with digital trails, recorded approvals, and bank transfers flowing directly into Andrew's personal account. There was no room for denial. Sarah dissected the case with chilling detachment, like a pathologist examining a decaying corpse. Mr. Gunawan slammed his fist onto the table, making Andrew flinch. He demanded an explanation. Panicking, Andrew tried to deny everything, blaming system errors and other staff members. But at that moment, Vivian lifted her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. With a trembling voice, Vivian accused Andrew. She claimed she had been forced to comply. As a subordinate, she said she had no power to refuse her superior's orders. She alleged that Andrew had threatened to fire her if she did not cooperate. With shocking ease, Vivian twisted the facts, casting herself the victim and Andrew the mastermind. Andrew stared at her in disbelief. The woman he thought was his ally had just stabbed him straight through the heart. Sarah observed the drama with an expressionless gaze. Then she presented the final piece of evidence. Security camera footage from Andrew's office showing Vivian entering, their discussions, and chat records proving Andrew's active approval of the profit-sharing scheme. That evidence silenced Vivian's lies and sealed Andrew's fate beyond any doubt. Disgusted, Mr. Gunawan slammed his fist onto the table, making Andrew flinch. He fired Andrew on the spot, without honor or severance. He declared the company would pursue criminal charges unless Andrew returned the full embezzled amount within 24 hours, plus penalties for corporate losses. Andrew collapsed from his chair to his knees, begging for mercy. He crawled toward Mr. Gunawan, then turned desperately to Sarah, calling his ex-wife's name in a hoarse voice filled with regret. "Sarah, please help me. I made a mistake." Sarah stood up, neatly gathered her files, and looked down at him. "I am here as an independent auditor, Mr. Andrew, not as your wife. Any chance for mercy ended the moment you signed the divorce papers." She turned and walked out, followed by her team, leaving Andrew howling in total ruin on the cold conference room floor. Andrew staggered out of the luxurious office building as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. In his hands was a small cardboard box containing his personal belongings, a stapler, a framed photo of himself, and a cracked coffee mug. The security guards who once greeted him respectfully now watched him with suspicion, ensuring he took nothing that belonged to the company. The midday sun burned his skin, yet Andrew felt frozen to the bone. In a single moment, he had lost everything, his position, his dignity, and his future, destroyed by the very woman he once called worthless. Mr. Gunawan's ultimatum echoed in his ears: return the money within 24 hours or go to prison. In blind panic, Andrew did the only thing he could think of to avoid jail. He sold everything he had left. His luxury watch was sold to a fence for a fraction of its value. Quick cash was all that mattered. His personal laptop, latest model smartphone, even the branded leather shoes he wore were dumped at secondhand electronics markets. He liquidated what little remained of his retirement fund. With immense effort, he managed to gather enough money to cover the company's principal loss, avoiding criminal charges. But it left him completely destitute. He returned to the empty rental house with a hollow expression and blood-red eyes. Waiting for him inside was Mrs. Rotmy, her face twisted with fury. News of his dismissal had spread quickly. Even the neighbors were whispering. Mrs. Rotmy did not ask how he felt. She did not offer comfort. She unleashed a torrent of insults, shaming him for being fired due to corruption and failing to become rich. She felt deceived. Her dream of a comfortable old age was gone. To her, a child without money was a failed investment. Without hesitation, Mrs. Rotme dragged her large suitcase into the living room and announced she was returning to her hometown that very day. She refused to live in poverty with Andrew or endure public humiliation. Andrew fell to his knees, begging her to stay. He promised he would rise again, find another job. Mrs. Rotme slapped his hand away coldly. She said she would only return when Andrew was successful again. She left on a motorcycle taxi, abandoning Andrew alone on the cold, unfurnished floor. That blow shattered what remained of Andrew's sanity. The next day, the landlord arrived and forcibly evicted him for failing to pay rent. Andrew wandered the streets with a bag of clothes on his back. He sent hundreds of job applications, corporations, startups, anywhere. But his reputation was destroyed. His name had been blacklisted by the Industry HR Association for fraud. Not a single company responded, not even an interview. His professional career was over. Desperate, Andrew lowered his standards. He tried registering as a rideshare or taxi driver, only to realize he had no vehicle. The company car was gone, and he owned no motorcycle. He couldn't even afford the deposit to rent an account. Hunger finally crushed what little pride he had left. Andrew walked the scorching city streets, offering himself as labor to food stalls, grocery stores, motorcycle wash stations. The man who once sat in air-conditioned offices commanding subordinates now begged for manual labor just to earn a plate of food. Most rejected him, his appearance disheveled, his eyes unstable with depression. Fate brought him back to the luxury restaurant where he once dined with Sarah and where he had once been humiliated in front of Vivian. Andrew entered through the back door and begged the kitchen manager for any job. The manager looked at him with a mix of pity and disgust, then pointed to a mountain of dirty dishes piled in a damp, foul-smelling corner. Andrew was hired as a daily dishwasher for minimal pay. That night, Andrew, the former arrogant branch manager, stood over a massive sink of greasy leftovers, hands that once held expensive pens, now rough and wrinkled, submerged in harsh soap water. The stench of spoiled food clung to his clothes, making him nauseated.
Regret came far too late, crushing his chest until breathing felt impossible amid the hot steam of the restaurant kitchen. 2 years had passed since that night in the kitchen. Life's wheel continued to turn, but for Andrew, it seemed permanently stuck at the very bottom. His face now looked 10 years older than his actual age, his skin darkened by the sun, his hair dull, streaked with neglected gray, and his body thin and brittle. Andrew now worked as an illegal parking attendant in an elite business district downtown. Every day he shouted directions at cars, inhaled exhaust fumes, and fought over territory with local thugs just for loose change that barely meant anything. He slept under shop awnings or on lucky nights inside a neighborhood guard post. His heart had gone numb. His pride had long been buried along with his once glorious past. Tonight, rain poured down mercilessly. Violent winds drove the water like needles against the skin. Andrew stood shivering in front of the lobby of a luxury convention center, wearing only a thin, torn orange plastic raincoat. There was a grand event inside, the grand opening of a new branch office of a multinational corporation. Luxury cars arrived one after another, dropping off impeccably dressed, fragrant guests.
Andrew's job was to escort them from their cars to the lobby with an umbrella shielding their expensive clothes from the rain, hoping for a tip born of wealthy generosity. A sleek black luxury sedan stopped directly at the entrance. It was the most expensive car that had arrived that night. Andrew rushed forward, clutching his slightly broken umbrella. He opened the rear passenger door swiftly and bowed deeply in respect, just like a servant. A pair of long legs stepped out, elegant high heels touching the wet asphalt. Andrew immediately raised the umbrella over the woman, shielding her from the rain. She stood upright, adjusting her beautiful gown. The soft, familiar scent of expensive perfume drifted into Andrew's nose, stirring memories long buried. Andrew slowly lifted his head to see who this distinguished guest was. At that exact moment, lightning split the sky, illuminating both of their faces. Andrew's eyes widened in shock. His heart felt like it was about to leap out of his chest. The woman before him was Sarah, but not the simple housewife Sarah he had divorced, not the cold professional auditor either. This was Sarah at her very best. She radiated confidence. Her skin glowed, her face calm and genuinely happy. From the opposite door stepped a man, Daniel, the lawyer who had once defended her. Now he stood tall beside Sarah, his hand gently resting on her back. It was a protective, loving gesture, one Andrew had never given her. They looked like a perfect, equal pair. Andrew's tongue went numb, his lips trembled, partly from the cold, partly from shock. He wanted to say her name. Sarah. The sound barely escaped his throat, hoarse, weak, swallowed by the roar of the rain. But Sarah heard it. She slowly turned toward the shabby parking attendant holding the umbrella. Their eyes met. Time slowed to a crawl for Andrew. He hoped Sarah would be shocked or angry or show any emotion that proved he still mattered. Even hatred would have been enough, even being cursed or spat on. At least that would mean he still existed to her. But Sarah's reaction was far more unexpected and far more painful than a slap. She looked straight into Andrew's eyes, recognizing her former husband under the rain and the deep lines of suffering on his face. Yet there was no anger, no hatred, only a polite, distant, neutral gaze, as if she were looking at a stranger she had never known. The gaze of a distinguished woman toward a minor service worker. Sarah was not surprised. She was not moved. Andrew was simply a parking attendant doing his job. She had completely moved on, reached a stage in life where Andrew's existence no longer carried any relevance. He was just a past chapter with no emotional weight left. Sarah offered a thin, formal smile. She opened her designer handbag worth tens of thousands of dollars and took out a $100 bill. She handed it to Andrew. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said, gently but firmly. The umbrella really helped. No Andrew, no drama, just professional courtesy. She placed the money into Andrew's dirty, trembling hand. "Keep the change. Buy yourself something warm to eat. It's cold out here," she added. Then she turned back to Daniel. Daniel wrapped an arm around Sarah's shoulders and guided her into the brightly lit, warm lobby, leaving Andrew outside in the rain. Andrew stood frozen as the storm poured down, his hand clenching the $100 bill given by his ex-wife. Rain mixed with tears streaming freely down his face. He watched Sarah's back disappear into the light, surrounded by people who respected her. The glass door slowly closed, separating two worlds now divided by class and destiny forever. Andrew finally understood that the cruelest karma was not poverty or prison, but complete indifference from the person who once loved him. To Sarah, Andrew was already dead. Andrew stared blankly at the building, crushing the bill in his hand, realizing that this piece of paper was the only thing left from the woman who had once given him her entire life. Under the increasingly heavy rain, Andrew collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably in eternal regret, an invisible spectator to the success of the woman he had once thrown away.